Afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. I am Teresa Terza, Head of Marketing at Sinolytics, and I will be your moderator for this session today. So thank you all for joining us. We are thrilled to have you with us as we dive into a topic that feels more urgent than ever, actually, technology and global power, the US, China, and the EU in a shifting world order. The geopolitical landscape is changing rapidly, and we can truly feel the heat of these power struggles in real time at the moment. Leading us through this important topic today is Ansgar Baums, who will share his insights on what these shifts mean for businesses and the global economy in a second. Before we get started, just a quick reminder, the session will be recorded and we will, of course, make the recording available to you afterwards. Also, I would like to encourage you to submit your questions throughout the session. We have the Q&A feature activated for you, so you can just send your questions in and we will make sure to address as many as we can at the end of the presentation. Now, let me introduce our speakers and agenda for today's session. First, Björn Konrad, CEO of Sinolytics, will start us off with a few introductory words. Next up is Ansgar Baums. Ansgar is a seasoned expert in geopolitical risk and international strategy. He brings loads of experiences from companies like HP, Zoom, SAP, and he will share his insights on how tech, policy, and global power shifts are shaping the business world today. The last 20 minutes of the webinar will then be fully dedicated to your questions. With that said, I would like to hand it over to Björn.
Thanks, Teresa, and warm welcome to everyone. Happy that you all found your way here. I'm extremely looking forward to this webinar because listening to and debating with Ansgar is always a very special pleasure and privilege, basically on any topic, but very especially on the topic of technology and geopolitics. So I can promise you are in for a treat for this next hour. Today, basically everyone is talking about how technological competition is at the very core, shaping geopolitical rivalries. Everyone is talking about how geopolitical power struggles are now being fought in the arenas of semiconductor fabs and AI data centers. So geopolitics and tech, that's kind of on everyone's mind now. But Ansgar has been talking about this, has been working on this, has been researching this for years and years. I actually distinctly remember our very first conversations when he first started to talk with me, kind of to tell me about separation of tech stacks and geotech statecraft, and that's many years ago. And I can assure you, a handful of people actually thought this through at that point. So this keen sense of what is shaping the world of tomorrow, I think that's one of Ansgar's many qualities, and that's why we are so extremely happy to have him here today, to have him share his insights during this webinar. We are even more importantly happy about him joining Sinolytics as a senior advisor and enriching many of our geopolitical projects with his expertise. So with that, I'm handing over to Ansgar to tell us about tech and geopolitics. Thanks.
Thanks so much for these kind words. So I'm not sure I can literally fulfill all these expectations now that you said, Björn. So you are going to be disappointed afterwards. Thank you, Björn, for that. No, pleasure talking to you on admittedly a very broad topic, right? So geopolitics and technology, that's a big topic, and so probably could spend 7-8 hours on this topic easily. So we have to be rather selective today, and happy to have follow-up conversations on any aspects that you find interesting. But for today, I decided to give you, let's say, starting with very few reflections on the fundamental relationship between geopolitics and technology. Then looking at geopolitical risks from a corporate perspective. So what does geopolitical risk mean for corporations? How do these risks look like? And then in the last part, focusing a little bit on insights from our practical work at Sinolytics with customers. how do you actually can start managing these risks? And with that, let's go into it. What I'm going to tell you today is largely based on the book Tech Cold War that I published with my dear former HP colleague, Nicholas Butts. Actually came out in February, techcoldwar.io. If you want to have more information, it has plenty of footnotes and stuff, so it's more academic in research, but hopefully still readable. So with that, let's quickly think briefly about the relationship between geopolitics and technology. I think it's fair to say that we as techies, as technology companies, talking now from my former experiences at HP, Zoom, Hewlett-Packard, SAP, etc., we as corporates didn't think much of geopolitics for a long time, right? So we didn't really care. Silicon Valley was very agnostic with regard to international relations and geopolitics. We didn't think it matters anymore because we thought the world is flat, the world is converging, there's going to be ever more free trade, borders matter much, military might also. So from now on, it's going to be basically the end of history moment that we can all, attune to and do our business on top of these frictionless global world. So we thought geopolitics and technology do not really relate to each other that much, other than maybe some military stuff, but that was very much a narrow segment of the economy. And this is the reason why the last years have come as an ugly surprise for many companies, because clearly now geopolitics is very closely connected to tech. If you read the newspapers, you can find some piece about the relationship of geopolitics and technology any given time. And this is new. And the interesting thing is, while this is new for us, it has basically been continuous relationship between technology and geopolitics over history. The problem is that we all grew up in the unipolar moment, which has been a very special moment in history where literally, free trade, frictionless world has been guaranteed by a singular power, which was the US. And in this time frame, the technology stack that we're talking about today has grown, has scaled. So for us, this was natural. But if you look at it from a long durée, it's basically a very unique moment. And now we're pivoting basically back to the normal in history, which is where governments deeply care about the dissemination of technology and deeply care about the control of the flow of technology. Why? Because technology is the most important change agent of geopolitics. Let me explain that in a second. Geopolitics would be rather static if it wasn't for technology. So what actually is driving change in geopolitics? It's certainly not the geo part, right? So it's not that tectonics move that much, right? Great Britain is still an island, so geopolitics shouldn't change that much if it was really only about the geo part. So there must be something else that's driving change. And if you look at the arguments, in the end, you come to the conclusion that the most important change agent actually is technology, because technology is the main driver of increases in productivity. And productivity is the main driver behind economic growth. And economic growth is the main driver behind military power projection. Can you see the presentation? Just see someone who can? Okay, all right. So in that regard, it has always been an interest of governments to control the dissemination of technology, basically trying to make sure that your geopolitical competitor doesn't grow faster than you do. The picture in the background, by the way, is an Assyrian warrior chariot, which actually there have been export controls in Assyria on warrior chariots, believe it or not. So as long as there is technology and as there are governments, there have been export controls and attempts to control technology dissemination. And in the end, you come to the conclusion that the geo part in geopolitics is actually a function of technology. And just to give you two historical examples. So there was a time when islands full of bird shit, also known as guano, have been of geopolitical importance. This was when guano was the main fertilizer, which was important to ensure food security in fast-growing nations in the end of the 19th century. So access to guano islands was of key geopolitical importance. And there were actually a war fought over these guano islands in the 19th century. So this was a matter of high geopolitical relevance to many countries in Europe. And it basically changed, not because, there was countries weren't growing anymore, but it changed because of technology. So Fritz Haber, German chemist, invented an artificial way of producing fertilizer, the Bosch-Haber process, still relevant today, and basically replaced the importance of a geolocation, an island, by an importance of a piece of technology, right? So in the end, you could argue technology completely changed geopolitics. The islands were still there, but they became irrelevant, right? Other example, the other way around is, take the Middle East. Lots of us would probably say, like, the borders drawn in the Middle East after the First World War are shaped by considerations of oil, of a natural resource. The question is, why became oil a big thing? Oil itself is completely without value, right? The reason why borders in the Middle East were shaped by oil is, of course, the combustion engine. So again, it's a piece of technology that assigned an importance to a certain part of the globe, a geolocation, simply because the combustion engine was important. And when the British Navy switched from steam and coal to oil, that basically triggered a development that has shaped the Middle East since 1917, when the Sykes-Picot Agreement drew these lines on the maps in order to make sure that Great Britain would have access to the oils of Iraq. So arguably, you could say, like, Carl Benz, the guy on the left side. I saw some people from Mercedes are on this call, so hello. So that Carl Benz basically was more important to the geography, basically to state and the creation of states in the Middle East than any other person, probably more important than even the politicians who were in charge of drawing these lines. With the invention of a piece of technology, the geopolitics of the Middle East changed dramatically. And I leave it at this point here with the general observations on tech and geopolitics. But just the key takeaway is it has always been an extremely close relationship. These two things, geopolitics and technology, always were connected to each other. I think we just forgot how closely connected they are because we all grew up in the unipolar moment. We all grew up in a time when geopolitics didn't seem to matter. But literally, this unipolar moment is a second in the longer history of humankind and technology. And I think we just took it, to be the normal. It was the big exemption. And now we are going back to a normal where, again, geopolitics will not leave technology alone because technology is such an important shaper of geopolitics. So we shouldn't be surprised that politicians actually care a lot about technology, and they will do so in the future. Now, with that off the table, let us focus on geopolitical risks. And admittedly, there's lots of reporting about this and lots of talk about it and lots of talk about de-risking from a corporate perspective, etc. pp. But it seems to lack a certain kind of, let's say, clarity or breaking it down to what does it really mean if I talk about geopolitical risks from a corporate perspective. And I, just want to give you a very, let's say, simple take on what we are actually talking about, also from a, let's say, corporate consultancy perspective when we talk about corporations and their geopolitical risk profile. In the end, I propose to distinguish two things. One is the corporate footprint. That's basically where your company is operating with exactly which kind of functions. So let's distinguish between upstream and downstream activities. Upstream means anything that you do before you sell your product, so product development, R&D, etc. pp, versus downstream activities. That's basically the selling of a product, right? So these are the two. If you want to distinguish everything that's happening in a company, you could probably do it in this way by saying this is an upstream activity, this is a downstream activity, and then you distinguish the most important geopolitical footprints that we have right now, which is China and Taiwan on one side, and the US footprint on the other side. That's your one dimension that you want to focus on. The second one is what we call risk vectors. So what is actually triggering geopolitical risks for corporations? From my perspective, it's three things. It could be a crisis event, a geopolitical crisis. Let's say something is happening in the Strait of Taiwan, two submarines collide by accident, and this triggers a an escalation, and then you have a quarantine around Taiwan, for example, which is breaking havoc on supply chains, for example. That's one thing. The second one is what we call geotech statecraft, and that's literally policy making, policies trying to control the dissemination of technology for the purpose of achieving geopolitical aims, right? So that's a policy that we need to understand. And then the third level is the split of the IT stack, literally the question how geotech statecraft and crisis events are actually influencing tech itself, how tech is developing, how tech looks like. I'm going to come back to this split of the IT stack in a second. If you take both dimensions together, the corporate footprint, where you do stuff as a company, right, on the one side, versus the risk vectors, the geopolitical risk vectors, you basically come to something that I'd call the corporate geopolitical risk profile that you need to manage. Now, events, I think, are pretty straightforward, right? So let's not focus too much on the crisis scenario of like what could happen in the Strait of Taiwan, but rather let's look at geotech statecraft, which I think requires some explanation. So as I said, geotech statecraft for us is the attempt to weaponize or use technology value chains to achieve your geopolitical purposes and to make sure that you control the dissemination of technology, because there is this strong link between technology dissemination, economic growth, and military might. And in the end, what we saw over the last years is basically a drastic expansion of the geotech statecraft toolbox, right? So all the export controls that you saw coming out of DC or Beijing, the import controls, tech employment controls, investment controls, we can go through all of it. You probably are familiar with some of the acronyms here, like ICTS on connected vehicles, or Hugo Forced Labor Prevention Act, or CFIUS. All these are basically part of the geotech statecraft toolbox with the aim to control the dissemination of technology. And what we see is basically that the development of these geotech statecraft tools is both driven out of Washington and out of China. And from a corporate perspective, it is key to anticipate and to understand how these toolboxes are developing and what they actually do with my company, with the value chain that I own, and which is subject to these controls, be it I use semiconductors and I cannot import them anymore. I have people based in China, and what they can do for my company is restricted now, etc., etc. So geotech statecraft, important to understand, and something that you actually need to spend quite some resources on to get behind it. The second part that I mentioned is the split of IT stack, and so it requires some explanation. So IT stack for us is this kind of layered architecture of how IT is actually functioning. So if you start at the bottom, it's compute power provided by semiconductors, and then you can go up in the stack through telco infrastructures like 6G, 5G, cloud infrastructure, endpoint devices, artificial intelligence, and then you have platforms and applications at the top. We think that this IT stack mirrors the geopolitical metastructure. So we have known one global IT stack over the past decades, simply because it was invented and created in the unipolar moment. As we are now entering a bipolar-ish world, we think that the IT stack will actually mirror that development and will also become bipolar. Means we will see a distinct Chinese IT stack based on distinct semiconductor compute architectures, on a distinct version of 6G. We do not think that 6G will be a global standard anymore. It will be a divided standard with separate cloud infrastructures, different endpoint devices, different artificial intelligences trained on different data sets with different governance models around it, and with different platforms and applications. And the reason for this is, of course, that the weaponization of technology is a vulnerability that you want to minimize as a government. And in the case of China, of course, it was the Huawei lesson that cutting off Taiwan from the Android OS has just shown how vulnerable you are if you depend on technology from the other side of your, from your geopolitical opponents. So China will do everything to become independent from critical US tech as soon as possible, and that creates basically a stack that is independent of Western technologies. And this is happening as we speak. It's almost complete on the platform applications level. So any given Chinese phone will there will be apps you barely recognize because you do not use them in the West. But it's also happening on the semiconductor level, where we see a keen interest of China to develop a compute architecture that's separate from x86 or ARM chips. We think the RISC-V chip architecture will be the most important one for China. So this is happening as we speak. And this is creating, of course, a completely new environment for corporations. Come back to this in a second. So what's the strategic response from a corporate perspective to these developments? Briefly speaking, mapping here the crisis events, geotech statecraft, and the split of the IT stack on the one dimension, I think there are three different responses that you need to consider. One is increasing supply chain transparency and resilience. The second one is the question of how should a company be designed to be geopolitically resilient? And the third one is a revision of the corporate strategy. And let me quickly go through them just to give you an impression of what this kind of strategic response on a corporate level means in practice. So the first one, increasing supply chain transparency and resilience, just going to report from what we actually do at Sinolytics when we work with customers. In the end, it's an exercise of understanding dependencies in the supply chain. And this is where you literally need to go down to the very nitty-gritty of the stuff that you actually procure as a company, the stuff that you actually procure in your supply chain, and understanding how these single components, and filtering is critical, right? So you need to identify those who really matter, the components, how these components are actually related to policy interventions of geotech statecraft. So how does my supply chain relate to export controls on high-end semiconductors? How does my supply chain relate to an ICTS connected vehicles? How does my supply chain relate to any kind of import controls or rule that is dreamed up in Washington or Beijing for that matter? And if you project these policies and policy scenarios on these singular components, you basically come up with something that we call the geopolitical risk score, where you can basically identify for each component how vulnerable they are to interferences, be it from geotech statecraft or from crisis events that we have identified prior as the main geopolitical risk vectors that matter here in that space. And that's basically what we currently try to do in taking this abstract notion of geopolitical risk and making it matter for someone who's actually taking supply chain decisions on procurement, who cannot deal with abstract concept like de-risking, but really needs a very granular picture of what does it mean if I procure? Should I buy this component or that? Can you tell me what the geopolitical risk is and what kind of money do I need to spend to mitigate these risks? That's very specific questions that you need to be ready to answer when you talk to supply chain organizations, right? All right, so that's the first one, increasing supply chain transparency. The next one is about redesigning enterprises. So to a certain degree, you could argue that corporations that we see today, that live today, are experts in global scale and hyper efficiency, right? This is what they were designed for. They're almost like survivors from a Darwinian competition, right? The better you are in this kind of hyperscale game, the better you survived actually in a hyper globalized world. Now, the problem is that this setup of corporations is not very well attuned to this new world full of geopolitical friction and interferences. And you can make it like very specifically, right? How many people really work on, and are familiar with export controls and know how to mitigate export controls? How big is your supply chain organization? How big is your strategy department? Is it capable of dealing with geopolitics? Do you have the corporate muscle to basically work with all this stuff that's basically now, incoming? And can you, translate this into meaningful decision points? It's a hard exercise. And I think we found that most companies are not equipped to actually do that, right? And this is where we think like redesigning the enterprise, how it actually works, what are the corporate muscles that you need is literally necessary. It also means that you need to adapt the corporations to to a new environment of more complexity in the market environment. So if you want to remain in China, you need to adapt to local rules. You need to adapt to cybersecurity regulation. You need to adapt to certain encryption standards. You need to adapt to all kinds of market access barriers. It basically means that you deepen your footprint. You widen your footprint in China, and you need to make sure that you have the right cell around it to protect it from geopolitical interferences. And that requires basically that you look to each level of your corporation and define a buffer strategy that provides you more geopolitical resilience if you try to operate in that environment. And lastly, it's about revising corporate strategy. And I just give you here like high-level view on how you can think about this. So if you again distinguish upstream and downstream activities and look at China, you can basically say that corporations who want to remain in China and want to serve the Chinese market are required to deepen their engagement in China because they need to develop products based on the now separate Chinese IT stack. And that requires more R&D, more product development, basically more of everything of your corporation in China. And that requires you to double down, right? In the end, it means you face now the challenge that if there are two stacks and you want to serve two stacks, you need to always have to deal with this dilemma on which side of the stack to invest your money, your R&D money. Do you want to become a two-stack player where you have basically to develop R&D your products on both sides of the stack, or do you want to focus on one stack? And that's basically a fundamental strategic decision that every company should take or should discuss at the board. How much effort is required in the future to sell both in the Chinese market as well as in the global market? Can I actually afford it? Or is it a problem that I now have to split my attention and my resources in a way that's now predetermined by the two-stack world that we now live in? So in the end, it means working our way up from the very tactical how to respond to friction of events to the way of how corporations need to design themselves to survive, to the very fundamental question, what is actually our corporate strategy based on a new split IT world? What does it mean for my future footprint in China and beyond? Is the kind of the cadence that you need to go up in order to fully capture actually the impact of geopolitical risk on a corporation. All right, I guess that was already a lot. So maybe we stop here and let's see if there are any questions.
There are. Right. Let me just go through them. First was very general. Do you separate technology and science? How do we differentiate this?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I'd say, I mean, science for me is a human activity, right? This is what humans do, and technology might be actually an outcome of science. The interesting question is, which I haven't really focused on here, is of course, what does geopolitics do to science? And I think we can already see that there is actually quite a huge impact on it. So if I look at the world of science and how it gets geopoliticized, it's actually quite relevant. So you see that research institutes are also need to do geopolitical risk assessments now when you think about, with whom can you partner? Partnering across the geopolitical divide will become very difficult in the future. So that's already happening. You see lots of restrictions on researchers, which kind of researchers you can put on which projects and corporations, etc. pp. So I think there is a lot going on in science, and it hasn't drawn much attention, interestingly, but I think it's certainly a big concern of the future, simply because as corporations, I think research institutes didn't care much about geopolitics over the last decades, but they might have to do in the future.
Right. Another question about export controls. What, in your perspective, is the future of strategic export controls in Europe? A coordinated approach from the EU, like overcoming institutional fragmentation?
Yeah, good question. I mean, background, the EU doesn't have a mandate really on export controls, right? Because export controls are a matter of national security. National security is not part of the EU mandate. That still sits largely with the member states. So the EU's mandate on export controls is quite narrow. It's not completely zero, but it's not that it can really design export controls and then roll them out and everybody has to do it, right? My sense is that there's not much appetite in fundamentally changing this institutional setup simply because it would require a lot of, let's say, political capital to pull it off. But I think there will be a more informal way of coordinating between the member states. The problem that I see is one of resources. So export controls are quite complicated, right? If you really want to follow the path that we've seen in the US, where you designate certain pieces of technology that you want to control, you need to become expert in tech value chains, and you need to identify those parts that, you know, what's the collateral damage, so to say? What are the network effects, second degree effects of such export controls? You need to actually know quite a lot about the industry to make them work. And I think that's really difficult for governments to achieve. I mean, even in the US, who has spent, let's say, they hired quite a lot of people, but still they are struggling with, you know, getting their heads around this problem. In Europe, I think we're just on a different level. I think in Germany, there might be less than 10 people who really care about high-tech value chains in the administration. And Germany might be the country that has actually most resources put on export controls. So literally becoming a heavyweight in the export controls game requires a lot of resources. And I haven't seen any signs that member states in Europe or the EU institutions are really capable of pulling it off. So my gut feeling is Europe will not have such a strong focus on export controls in the future. For the simple reason, you know, it's a very difficult exercise, and I don't see the resources to back it up.
Thank you. There are more questions, actually. Do you think that there is a probability that the remaining stack, formerly known as global, is likely to be further fragmented, given the weakening trust between Europe and the US?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I think it's top of mind for many right now. To look back at the last weeks when we had the Maxar debate and we had the kill switch / pull the plug debate, etc., and the F-35 discussion. Are we too dependent on US tech? I think it's a real issue within the Western stack. So I don't see anyone else being capable of really creating a third stack. I mean, just imagine, who could build a different compute architecture other than x86 or ARM in Europe? I don't see any consortium, any company, anyone being really capable of doing that, simply because it's such a expensive and exercise. So I don't think Europe is capable of actually building a third independent stack. It's not commercially viable. No one's interested in it. But what will certainly happen is that we will negotiate dependencies and the vulnerabilities of being subject to a weaponization of these parts of the stack with our partners on the other side of the Atlantic. And it will be an important conversation about what's the right level of dependencies. It will also be about interdependencies. So how do we actually make Europe indispensable in the stack so we become less vulnerable to one-sided pressure? But this will take place based on the Western stack. It will not be a play to replace the Western stack in Europe by a third stack. I think that's an important distinction. And I'd argue we should focus strategically in Europe on becoming indispensable in the Western stack. SAP is a very good insurance not to be bullied too much, right? Because more than half of US companies using SAP. So it's not that we have nothing, right? I think we should just focus on actually creating more SAPs in Europe. That's a very smart strategy to remain relevant and not be bullied too much, no matter by whom, right? So.
This is a question in regard to Chinese-sourced telecom equipment. We saw a lot of US regulatory restrictions on these in the last few years. And so far, the new Trump administration did not put forward IT-specific restrictions on Chinese tech, leaving general tariffs aside. So do you think this is just a matter of time or potentially a shift in strategy?
Yeah, very good question. Very much top of mind. So I think we all watched this space, right? And what we saw is that the second Trump administration focused on neither on tech nor on China, right? It is basically going after close allies, actually, and it's focusing on indiscriminatory tariffs. So exactly the opposite of actually what the Biden administration had done, right? So question is now, is this stable? Is this really a new strategy, or is this just a matter of tactics and prioritization and of cadence? My gut feeling is it's literally a matter of cadence. I think the Trump administration has focused on tariffs simply because Trump really believes in tariffs. He thinks this is smart economic policy, and he wants to do that first in his term. And he's somewhat trying to solve the Ukrainian issue. Not commenting on how he's trying to achieve that, but this seems to be, his priority list. But I expect we will be back to the tech square as soon as his attention is shifting towards China, and then we probably will see an interesting, let's say, this kind of what political scientists call issue linkage. So you will see that Trump will try to connect diverse issues, like maybe controls on telco equipment with questions on status of Taiwan and with whatever kind of other topic is now on the table, and try to bring them together and basically create pressure that is then leveraged. So in that sense, the first Biden administration has been much more pragmatic with regard to these tech controls, in a sense that they always perceive them as negotiable and as assets in a gamble, a power gamble, whereas the Biden administration was much more diligent and systematic and trying to build up literally a geotech statecraft toolbox that's orderly and working and addressing all the observable risks in a very, let's say, almost scientific manner. I think for the Trump administration, all of that doesn't really matter. It's literally about creating pressure and then getting something for it when you do the famous deal thing. So a long answer to a very good question means I think we will see more tech and more on China within the next months. We're not there yet, but I'm pretty certain that it will return, and then we are talking about all this kind of stuff in a very, let's say, in a different frame than the Biden administration had, which was rigorous. Now we will talking about a very flexible and tactical approach of the Trump administration.
I love to see all these questions coming, and thank you so much for discussing this so lively. What kind of counteractions by China do you foresee for the action of US putting CATL on a military blacklist and the major 6 Chinese battery companies on an entity list?
Ooh, that's a very specific question. So first, I think the classical way of China to respond to these threats is asymmetrical, right? So China has always, they don't respond necessarily like you put tariffs on X and China responds with tariffs, or you put export controls on X and China mirrors these measures. It has always been much more, let's say, strategic and targeted on the side of China. So the putting certain companies on entity lists doesn't necessarily mean that China will react in the same manner. As far as I understand, the companies that have been put on the unreliable entity list in China, usually, the impact was rather limited because these companies didn't do much business in China anyhow. I mean, putting Lockheed Martin or Raytheon on that list doesn't matter because they don't sell anything in China at all, right? So it's basically a more symbolic act. I think the big question is like, if it really matters economically, who would be the target? I can't tell. Maybe Björn has a view on it. What the trajectory of retaliation for that kind of gamble would be. My only takeaway is that China is actually not the one who's really trying to turn on the volume that much in response to these kinds of actions. But Björn, maybe you have a point.
Sure, I do. I always do. Yes, and I would just second what you said without going into too much detail here. I think China has been showing quite an interesting portfolio of different measures. They've been very targeted with the responses, also very measured in many ways, right? It's kind of, and in comparison to the US approach, also China has been trying to be extremely predictable. I think even on purpose to be predictable on its responses, just to kind of show the counterbalance, kind of how you can play this. So I would say kind of there's always been, for every US action, there's been some sort of a fairly predictable counteraction. It has never been overdone so far. It kind of has been quite on the symbolic side, as Ansgar has mentioned, and I think that's. But it also shows the toolbox, right? China is at the moment still in the phase of showing the toolbox to the world, basically saying, this is our unreliability list. That it's powerful, but so far we choose to put only companies on there that don't hurt that much from being put on the list, right? So but also kind of at the same point making the point that we can put anyone on that, right? So that's, I think it's at the moment the state of play. China has been playing all of this very calmly, I think, at the moment, but at the same time showing the teeth that they could use to bite in the future.
Okay. Another attendee has a question regarding the IT stack. Do you see handling, or so to say, a separation of the IT stack as an integrated part of the business strategy, or something that can be worked on independently?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Worked on independently by whom? This person can clarify. Maybe giving you a very practical example, like why does it matter, or what does it actually mean? So we know that technologies like encryption, like hardware-based trusted platform modules, like data exports, that all has been subject to very specific rules in China, right? So you cannot use a TPM 2.0 in China. You have to. The iPhone in China is run on a different cloud rather than the global iPhone. The cars that will run and connect to connected cars, connected vehicles, will need to connect to a Chinese version of 6G in the future. So all these kind of rules and restraints basically mean that your product will be based on different technologies, as simple as that, right? And that requires you to actually invest in these separate technologies, to understand them, to integrate them, to become good at them. So your competitors will be really good on connecting, to the Chinese IT stack, connected vehicles, whatever. So you need to be as good as them. So that requires you to deepen your engagement and to become really familiar with that kind of technologies. And this, so you get basically drawn into it. You have no choice. If you want to remain in China and be commercially successful, you need to invest in these capabilities. And that is basically, sucking you, so to say, in. And there's not much of an option if you want to play there. And then you basically look at, okay, I'm producing cars, but actually I'm producing now two very different cars that are not really compatible with each other. The one is for the Chinese market, and the one at plus X, by the way, we don't know how the stack will actually spread versus a car that can run in the West. And the rules are very clear, right? If you look at something like geotech statecraft, like ICTS for connected vehicles that has been released in the US, it's very clear that you will never be able to to sell a Chinese connected car based on Chinese technologies in the US. It will just not happen. It's no longer possible. And I think that's the future for many parts of the stack. Sorry.
There's another question also related to the tech stack topic. Do you think an increasing bet on open source tech stacks helps better to mitigate the risks mentioned?
Short answer, no. Because I think open source is not the safe haven. Actually, it has been drawn into geopolitics already. So just check the RISC-V debate in Washington lately. So RISC-V, open source project, years ago founded at University of Berkeley. RISC-V association has moved to Switzerland from the US. Classic move, right? To somewhat become independent from geopolitics, but I think it's not really working. In Washington, there's now a debate that open source is a leak of technology, a hole in the geotech statecraft tool set that you cannot control the knowledge and technology that's transferred in open source projects to the Chinese. And there has been explicit statements by former DOC Raimondo, by Mike Gallagher, former chairman of the Select Committee on CCP, and others who are actually saying we need to stop that leakage of knowledge and technology through open source projects. And there are a couple of tools that you could probably already use to make that happen. So if you look at certain part of export control lists, if you would put companies that are participating in these open source consortiums on an entity list, you could basically prevent any US person from doing any transaction with these entities. And that's basically would include not only commercial transaction, but would also include something like collaborating on an open source project. So the toolbox is already there to crack down hard on open source. And I think that's very likely going to happen in the next years.
Do you think geopolitics will still play a bigger role in tech competition in the Trump times?
Absolutely. I mean, let's look beyond the media attention and the the smoke screen of different US administrations, incoming, outgoing, etc. pp. If you just look at the development of the geotech statecraft policy toolkit, it has been very linear, very stable. In the end, you saw the revision of export controls was triggered by the late Obama administration, Kevin Wolf, FDPR, etc. pp. It has progressed a little bit chaotically, admittedly, under the first Trump administration. Biden didn't do any rollback, rather the opposite. He expanded the toolkit, and it's still in place, right? There hasn't been a rollback on Biden's policies on semiconductors so far under Trump. So there's a lot of continuity, right? And it's a clear direction in which this is going. The interesting part is the matter of CHIPS Act, right? So on the subsidy side, on this side, there might be some changes simply because Trump doesn't believe in subsidies. But in the end, again, it's all there. It's more about let's say finding different tools to achieve the same purpose, but not really a change of direction. So again, forget about the kind of, let's say, we used to look at US policies at, Obama, Trump, Biden, Trump. Take that away and you will see a very linear direction of where things are going. And the same might arguably is true for China, where you also see a lot of continuity of expansion of controls. Secure and controllable technology has been a mega trend, and lots of tools have been invented, assembled to achieve secure and controllable technologies. Very stable trend. So in that sense, there's less surprise and more stability in this trends than you might think if you just read the headlines.
And question came in about the IT stack. So this is a topic, many have questions on. German companies in machinery industry are designing their products to be used in connection with the IoT, Internet of Things. Does your requirement of different IT stacks mean that an IoT has to be set up separately for China?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, what is IoT? It's in the end certain kind of compute capabilities on the device, right? Be it thin client or a fat client, whatever kind of architecture you want to implement. And then you have a connectivity piece, probably mobile networks, right? So we're talking about some kind of 5G connectivity, whatever. And then you have somewhere a data center, data crunching, whatever, analytical level, et cetera, pp. And this is exactly, I mean, if you look through the IT stack, you could argue an IoT device employs all the things that I mapped here, right? So an IoT device is basically nothing else but a small part of the, it mirrors the IT stack as we see it here. And therefore, you will see, just take the question of, at some point, you probably want to have some encryption in your connectivity of your IoT device because you don't want to have it completely insecure, right? Then just look at encryption. I mean, we know how politically contested encryption is in China. So it's, there's very specific regulation on encryption, TC260 standards, whatever. So it's highly political and it's going to be very China specific. So, and then if you think about hardware-based encryption, where you have a hardware-based roots of trust again, you have something that's baked into your like as a system of a chip version of a trusted platform module separately from the chip. You will have something that's on the semiconductor platinum that will be must be specifically designed for China, because you're not allowed to run a TPM that's not approved by Chinese authorities in China. And same goes in which cloud goes, to which cloud does all your IoT stuff connect? Well, in the future, probably not to an AWS cloud if you run an IoT device in China. Right? So go through the stack and you will see that IoT will also be very much subject to this split IT stack logic.
More tech stack coming now. So you clearly see a pathway to a non-Chinese tech kit and to a pure Chinese, maybe plus a Chinese friends tech kit. Could German companies serve both worlds if they build up pure dual play capabilities? Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly the ambition, right? So it, by the way, explains also FDI patterns, right? So plenty of people were puzzled by, why is FDI from Europe into China not decreasing because everybody's talking about de-risking. What we really see is basically a concentration of FDI. So fewer companies are responsible for a bigger share of FDIs. And what's the reason? Well, it's the big guys. Switching to this slide here, it's the dual players, right? The big guys will really go for a true in China for China strategy. So they're investing more to become part of the new Chinese ecosystem that will, in the future be based more and more on a Chinese IT stack. The big question then is, as an international company, can you actually run that system, right? Or do you become so vulnerable to geopolitics that you will not be able to run it? This is why companies are building this buffer strategy, right? So they're trying to isolate their Chinese business as much as they can. So in a sense, you could argue companies will also be bipolar. You will have one company which in the end, in reality, has very few connectivity between the two parts of the company. So your company part China will be almost independent from your global company part, including finance, including business operations, separated IT infrastructures, separated data, customer data handling, separated product development, R&D, so you don't export IP anymore to prevent export controls on IP, et cetera, pp, right? So this is what I mean with redesigning enterprises in order to increase your geopolitical resilience that serves the purpose of being able to be part of both stacks.
A follow-up question on this. One of our attendees is interested in understanding the role that IT can play, especially without a clear business strategy of segregation of the full company, maybe to prepare for future changes to business structures. Maybe you can say a few more words on this.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, arguably, you could say that it is a smart strategy anyhow to think about being able to separate your Chinese operations no matter what, right? So being kind of flexible and agile enough to be able to split it off, be it for you want to split it off or minimize connectivity because you want to protect your operations in China from geopolitical vectors, risk vectors, or because you decide at some point China is becoming too complex, I cannot afford it anymore, I want to put my asset on the market. And the easier you can split off, you can carve out this asset and put it on the market, the quicker, the better it is, right? So I would design a company now for basically anticipating either a buffer strategy to maintain business in China or to be able to sell off your assets quickly. Both basically means on an IT infrastructural perspective, be ready, right? So have this kind of IT infrastructure designed for being able to carve out this your China business. That makes, for me, it's a no-brainer, right? I would do this right away, no matter what, because it makes sense both for going back to this chart here, right? So you either have the cash cow approach, I will milk the cow as long as I can and then I sell it. So you prepare for exit, or you prepare for a true in China for China strategy. From an IT infrastructural perspective for corporations, it's literally a lot of the same steps need to be taken. So it's a no-brainer.
Last question. Due to the limited time, how could China's predominant role in rare earth exports influence this race for tech power?
Yeah, it can certainly. I mean, it can. So it's one part of the tech stack, very low in the logic. So I haven't included it in the graph, but literally it's one of those dependencies that could be weaponized, right? And there have been signs that, as Björn said, like China is almost more interested right now in showing the toolkit rather than using it. So they put export controls on raw materials, but it's basically not a prevention of exports. It's simply a licensing agreement or requirement now. And basically they grant many of the licenses, but they just showed everyone, hey, if we really want to, do this, we can cut this off. So it's this sort of Damocles that's serving a tactical purpose right now. That's the one thing. So certainly in the mix, it's probably one of the strongest assets that China has in this game. Second part, of course, we all know that it's not really about the tons of rare earth available, whatever. It's an economic function, right? So it's just a question of how much is online now, how much can be put online later. Where's the refinery capacities right now? How long does it take to build refinery capacities somewhere else in the world? So we're literally, the picture is more complex than just, oh, there's 2 mountains of rare earth and they're both in China and there's nothing else. That's not how it works. So it's a very complex picture. And I think China is very much aware that it's a much more complicated game that you play here. And if you cut off raw material supplies, well, then it's commercially viable to dig somewhere else at a higher cost point, and that will simply bring other supplies online, and China wouldn't sell more. So it's not really a very appealing strategy for China to actually execute on the export controls. So it's just a little bit more complicated than sometimes media headlines suggest.
So thank you all for these great questions, and Ansgar, of course, for answering all of them and for making this such a dynamic and insightful discussion. If you would like to explore this topic a little further, feel free to scan the QR code on the screen. It will take you to our latest resources on our services related to supply chain and geopolitical risk assessment. And of course, if you have any follow-up questions we could not answer in this round here today, we would love to hear from you. We appreciate you joining us today. Have a wonderful rest of your day. We look forward to staying connected. Take care and see you soon.
Thank you so much.